also got easy programs, energy efficiency programs, driving energy efficiency in commercial buildings across Australia, driving energy efficiency in large industrial complexes, requiring them to implement the energy efficiency opportunities that they've identified in the audits that have been conducted to date. Instead of this, set against that bold vision, what Rudd Labor promised in the budget is a confused hodgepodge of small-scale investments targeted at achieving media coverage now, a few photo opportunities down the track, and very little in the way of real emissions reductions. The Rudd government has broken an election promise to spend $225 million over 3 years to 2010-11, instead committing only $126 million by that time. The Greens loan scheme, the government scheme, is tokenism, when what we need is systematic change. With only $240 million allocated, a third of it's not to be spent until after the next election. It could give loans to as few as 24,000 households if each chooses to borrow at the top end of the $10,000 limit. The slow start with no sense of urgency means that as few as 1,360 homes could benefit in the next year, and only 16,000 before this government's term could be ended at the next election. What's more, by only providing financial support, it ignores the other well-known barriers to people taking up energy efficiency opportunities, namely lack of information and lack of priority. The low emissions plan for renters is similarly tokenistic and ill thought out. With only a $500 rebate available for landlords to install insulation, less than half the cost in many cases, landlords still have very little incentive to save their tenants energy and money. It also has a slow and late start. Housing assistance is one way to permanently reduce costs for all low-income earners. All new housing initiatives must meet high energy efficiency standards and be on public transport routes. Immediate housing affordability is not seriously addressed in the budget, as people are still struggling to find affordable rental properties or struggling to pay their mortgages. The Clean Business Australia initiative, Climate Ready, the Green Building Fund and retooling for climate change are much more of the same, piecemeal, minimally funded, with no sense of urgency. The Greens headline 3, healing our country by ending the logging of the remaining native forests and clearing of savannas, restoring and building resilience in ecosystems and maintaining the carbon they store. This would be a climate and biodiversity winner, but instead the government continues to drive ecological destruction and the destruction of rural communities by slashing the environment budget, and continue to subsidise logging and the managed investment schemes that are destroying river systems and town water supplies, as well as social harmony in rural Australia. The carbon and biodiversity tragedy of the loss of old-growth forests in Tasmania, Victoria and New South Wales can be sheeted home to the Rudd government just as much as to the Howard government. Minister Garrett is just as responsible as his predecessor. Under Rudd Labor, Collins Street farmers are set to own the water in our rivers and pay nothing for our groundwater. According to the government's 2007 tax expenditure statement, the tax deductibility of forestry managed investment funds will cost $140 million in 2008-9, $365 million in 9-10 and $425 million in 2010-11. In other words, the Rudd government plans to pay the rich to destroy our ecosystems, foregoing almost $1 billion over 3 years. Meanwhile, they're taking $50 million away from the Department of the Environment and abolishing the Biodiversity Hotspots program. Caring for our country is ad hoc, unstrategic, with no increase in environment spending. It demonstrates that the government has failed to learn the positive and negative lessons of the Natural Heritage Trust. Once again, there's no understanding of the need for landscape-scale restoration or the urgency of the task. For example, the Murray-Darling Basin has still not set long-term targets for return of water to the Murray, and amazingly, the Murray-Darling Basin Plan does not come into effect until 2019. 2019, we will have a plan and no river. The much-vaunted reform has not overcome the conflict between the states. The science says that 3,500 gigalitres of water must be returned to the system if it's to have any chance of recovery. When are we going to get it, Prime Minister? Green Headline 4, redesigning and revitalising Australia's major cities into urban villages linked by rapid mass transit and cycleways. This is not only a great climate idea, it goes to the heart of the stress and obesity crisis we face. The Greens would invest heavily in public transport and redesign our cities to be people-friendly rather than car-friendly. We'd allocate at least 25% of the $22.3 billion AusLink 2 funding for 2009-10 through to 13-14 to major infrastructure projects that shift people or freight off roads and onto more climate-friendly alternatives. By 2014, the proportion of funding for low-polluting and mass transit options should be greater than that for roads, but it is certainly not going to be the case. Imagine the difference to people's quality of life if they could walk to work or cycle in their neighbourhoods and move between neighbourhoods on rapid transit. The oil crisis and the climate crisis makes it critical that jobs are taken to where the people are rather than move people to the jobs. This would mean that people have more time to enjoy their lives, would be healthier, breathe cleaner air and get to know their neighbours. Instead, the Rudd government has invested only $78 million into dealing with congestion and has continued with billions into roads and freeways. No government that takes peak oil seriously or climate change seriously would spend only 5% as much on rail as on road funding in the coming year. They haven't even had the courage to abolish the fringe benefits tax concession for motor vehicles, the cost of which will be about $1.6 billion in this financial year alone. Getting rid of it would have been a clear climate winner and behaviour change driver. It would have taken people out of cars and onto public transport if an equivalent tax concession was made for public transport. Even with cars, we have no vehicle fuel efficiency standards, and the Rudd Green Car program, much spun and publicised, doesn't begin until 2011, after the next election. The Greens would expand the AusLink funding guidelines to include urban, intrastate and interstate public transport infrastructure projects. We would ensure that AusLink's corridor strategies would address the issue of oil vulnerability and greenhouse gas mitigation. And finally, the Greens' fifth headline for a sustainable Australia by 2020, going with our own food. Imagine if Australians produced more of our own food and produced it sustainably. It's a high-level goal because it goes to the heart of our health and well-being and the interaction in our neighbourhoods and our interaction with our rural communities. The world's food production systems are becoming increasingly frayed by ecological degradation and human rights abuses. Every Chinese frozen vegetable that finds its way into Australian mixed frozen vegetable packs is subsidised by environmental destruction and low wages. Extreme weather events will drive shortages as land is turned over to biofuels, cooking oils and plantation forests. In spite of the free trade mantra, countries are now declaring food emergencies.